In the shadowed cradle of the Carpathian peaks, where the wind whispers secrets to the frost-kissed pines, a single drop of blood can bind fates across centuries, turning sacrifice into sovereignty. The village of Eldridge Hollow clung to the mountainside like a forgotten prayer, its thatched roofs bowed under the weight of perpetual twilight. Rain lashed the cobblestones in relentless sheets, drumming against the warped shutters of the elder's hut where Alara Voss stood, her wrists bound by coarse rope that bit into her rain-slicked skin. At 24, she was a wisp of a woman, her once vibrant auburn hair now matted and dull, her emerald eyes hollowed by the fever that had claimed her family one by one. Orphaned at 16, abandoned by a world that saw her as a curse, her mother's whispers of marked blood echoing in the villagers' suspicions, Alara had survived on the fringes, tending the sick until the plague twisted irony upon her, leaving her body a vessel of quiet decay. She dreamed of escape, of a life beyond the mud and murmurs, but tonight her desires curdled into dread. The elders encircled her, their faces gaunt masks illuminated by the flicker of a single tallow candle, its flame dancing like a hesitant soul. Old Harlan, the village patriarch, his voice gravelly from years of invoking ancient pacts, intoned the ritual words. The tribute must be pure, unyielding. The shadows demand their due, lest they claim us all. Alara's heart thudded against her ribs, a distant drum in the storm's symphony, as they spoke of the vampires, whispers made flesh, rulers of the eternal night who dwelled in the crumbling spires of Castle Dravenholm, high above the mist-shrouded valleys. For generations, the Hollow had offered brides to appease the bloodthirsty court, virgins bartered for fragile peace. But Alara was no virgin in the flower of youth. She was broken, her body racked by the fever's insidious grip, her spirit frayed by betrayal. Why her? The question burned unspoken, for in Eldridge, questions were luxuries the damned could not afford. They led her through the downpour, torches sputtering in the gale, their light casting elongated shadows that slithered like serpents across the path. The air tasted of iron and pine, thick with the scent of wet earth and impending doom. Ilara's bare feet sank into the mud, each step a jolt of cold fire up her legs, her simple woolen dress clinging like a shroud. She thought of her mother, who had vanished into the castle 20 years prior, leaving only a locket etched with a thorny rose, a symbol of thorns that pierced the heart yet promised bloom. Alara clutched it now, the metal warm against her chilled palm, a talisman against the abyss. As the castle loomed, its black stone walls jagged against the roiling sky, the gates groaned open on rusted hinges, swallowing the procession whole. The interior was a labyrinth of decayed opulence, vaulted ceilings lost in gloom, tapestries frayed by time depicting hunts under blood moons, and floors of cracked marble that echoed their footsteps like accusations. Servants, pale figures with eyes averted, ushered her to the great hall, where crystal chandeliers hung inert, their prisms catching stray glimmers from wall sconces fed by eternal flames. There, upon a throne of ebony and velvet, sat King Victor Draven, the immortal sovereign whose name evoked both reverence and terror. He was not the monstrous relic of village tales. At first glance, he appeared a man in his prime, perhaps 30, with raven hair falling in disciplined waves to his shoulders, his features chiseled as if by a sculptor's lament. High cheekbones, a jaw shadowed with stubble, and eyes like polished obsidian, holding depths that promised both salvation and ruin. But eternity marked him. The subtle pallor of skin unscarred by sun, the poised stillness that belied centuries of solitude. Born in the 14th century amid the ashes of a peasant uprising, Victor had been turned during a brutal siege, his maker a warlord vampire who taught him the cost of power. He had risen as king, forging a realm from chaos, yet guilt gnawed at him, the lives he had taken, the loves he had outlived. The ethical code he clung to like a fraying shroud, forbidding the turning of the innocent without consent. Solitary by choice, he ruled with a melancholic justice, haunted by the memory of a mortal wife lost to plague, her death etching an invisible scar across his undead heart. His gaze fixed on Alara as the elders bowed low, murmuring their offering. "She is yours, my lord, tainted by fever, but of the old bloodline. May she sate the court's hunger." Victor's lips thinned, a flicker of disdain crossing his face, not for her, but for the barbarity of the pact. He rose, his black cloak whispering against the stone, and approached with the grace of a predator who had long forsaken the hunt for necessity alone. Up close, Alara caught the faint scent of aged wine and sandalwood on him, an anachronism in this tomb of grandeur. "You tremble," he said, his voice a low timbre that resonated through the hall like distant thunder, carrying the weight of forgotten languages. He extended a hand, gloved in fine leather, and with surprising gentleness severed her bonds. The rope fell away, leaving red welts that stung like accusations. Alara met his eyes, defiance sparking through her haze of fear and illness. "I am no sacrifice," she whispered, her voice raw from disuse. "I am Alara Voss, and I come not willingly, but I will not beg." A ghost of a smile touched his lips, the first crack in his eternal composure. "Nor should you. This castle devours the weak, but perhaps you carry a strength the elders overlooked." He gestured to a side chamber, where a fire crackled in a hearth of carved gargoyles, casting golden flickers across velvet drapes. As she was led away, attendants offering a basin of steaming water scented with lavender, luxuries unknown in the hollow, Alara felt the fever's grip loosen, just a fraction, as if his presence alone warded off the chill of death. That night, as moonlight filtered through arched windows like silver veins, Alara explored the chamber's shadows. Her fingers brushed a concealed alcove, revealing a pedestal veiled in dust. Beneath the cloth lay a dagger, its hilt encrusted with rubies that gleamed like congealed blood, the blade etched with runes of ancient power. Legends whispered of the queen's blade, wielded only by she who could claim the throne beside the king, a weapon that bound life to undeath, love to eternity. Why here, hidden for her touch? As her hand hovered, a drop of her blood, seeping from a thorn-pricked finger on the locket, fell upon the hilt, and the runes ignited with an otherworldly glow. In the corridor beyond, Victor paused, sensing the stir of old magic. His heart, long silent, quickened with a forbidden hope. What choice had fate forced upon them both? And would she wield it as savior or slayer? The chamber's air hung heavy with the scent of beeswax and forgotten incense, the fire's embers pulsing like a weary heartbeat against the encroaching night. Alara withdrew her hand from the dagger as if scorched. Though no heat emanated from its rune-etched blade, only a thrumming vibration that resonated through her veins, syncing with the fever's erratic rhythm in her blood. The rubies on the hilt caught the firelight, winking like eyes awakened from slumber, and for a moment she swore the metal whispered her name, a silken thread weaving through the haze of her exhaustion. She had pricked her finger on the locket's thorn earlier, a careless habit born of clutching it like a lifeline, but now that single crimson bead had unlocked something ancient, something that smelled of iron and eternity. She backed away, her bare feet silent on the threadbare rug, heart pounding in a cadence that echoed the distant drip of water from the castle's eaves. The room, with its four-poster bed draped in faded crimson silk and walls lined with books whose spines cracked like old bones, suddenly felt less like sanctuary and more like a gilded trap. Alara Voss, who had mended the dying in Eldridge Hollow with trembling hands and hollow prayers, now stood at the precipice of a revelation she could neither name nor flee. Her body ached, the fever coiling tighter in her chest, but beneath it stirred a clarity, sharp as the blade before her, a defiance that whispered she was no mere tribute, no vessel for appeasement. Outside, the storm had softened to a mournful patter against the leaded panes, the wind carrying faint howls from the forest below, where wolves prowled the borders of the mortal and the damned. Victor Draven moved through the shadowed corridors of Castle Dravenholm with the fluid silence of one who had outlived empires, his senses attuned to the castle's every sigh. The awakening of the Queen's blade had rippled through him like a stone cast into still water, stirring memories he had buried deeper than the catacombs beneath the keep. He had hidden the dagger centuries ago, after the fall of his queen, Isolde, a mortal woman whose love had briefly thawed his eternal frost, only for plague to claim her before he could offer the gift of undeath. She had refused it in life, fearing the monster it might forge, and in her death, Victor had sworn an oath. No more turnings without consent, no more binding of souls to his shadowed realm. The blade, forged in the fires of a long-forgotten war between vampire clans, was meant for a consort who could wield its power without corruption, a queen to rule beside him in fragile alliance against the encroaching human wars that threatened their fragile peace. Yet now it called to this frail human, her blood, tainted, they said, by some old lineage, igniting its runes. Victor paused at an arched window, the moonlight etching silver lines across his face, highlighting the faint scar along his jaw from a battle long faded. Guilt, that faithful companion, twisted in his chest. He had accepted tributes before, sustaining his court with measured sips, but never had one stirred the embers of his isolation. Ilara's scent lingered in his mind, rain-soaked earth and the faint tang of illness, undercut by something wild, untamed. He desired not her blood, but her story, the fire in her eyes that mirrored his own buried longings. To approach now risked everything. The court's restless nobles, scheming in their velvet crypts, whispered of weakness in his solitary rule, of alliances forged through marriage rather than conquest. But the blade's call was inexorable, a ritual demanding choice. Ilara sank onto the edge of the bed, the mattress yielding like a sigh, and traced the welts on her wrists where the ropes had chafed. The lavender water from earlier had eased her skin, but not the turmoil within. Memories flooded her, her mother's final days, raving of a marked blood that drew shadows, of a locket passed down from a grandmother who had fled the castle as a girl, whispering of a love that damned and saved. Ilara had dismissed it as fevered delusion, just as the villagers had dismissed her own illness as curse. Abandoned, yes, left to scrape herbs from barren soil while neighbors crossed the street. But desiludida? No, not entirely. In the hollow's mud-choked despair, she had clung to a quiet ethic. Heal what you can, endure what you must. Now, in this opulent decay, that ethic warred with terror. Was the dagger a weapon or a lure? To touch it again might claim her or free her, but freedom in Dravenholm tasted of chains. A soft knock echoed, pulling her from reverie. The door creaked open, admitting a servant girl no older than 16, her skin porcelain pale, eyes wide with the deference of one half-turned, lingering in limbo. "My lady," she murmured, voice like rustling leaves, bearing a tray of silver, a goblet of mulled wine steaming with cloves, bread warm from unseen ovens, and a vial of amber liquid that shimmered unnaturally. "The king bids you eat. Strength for the night ahead." Ilara eyed the vial warily. Elixir, perhaps. To stave off her fever, but accepted the tray, the girl's fingers brushing hers cold as marble. As the door closed, Ilara sipped the wine, its warmth spreading through her like liquid fire, dulling the ache in her limbs. The bread crumbled soft on her tongue, a luxury that brought tears to her eyes. When had she last eaten without fear of spoilage? But the vial she set aside, its glow reminding her of the dagger's light. Rising, she returned to the alcove, the cloth still draped haphazardly. Her hand trembled as she lifted the blade, heavier than expected, its balance perfect in her grip. The runes pulsed faintly, syncing with her slowing pulse, and visions flickered at the edges of her sight. Battles in moonlit fields. A woman with auburn hair like hers, wielding the dagger against a tide of shadows. A king kneeling in bloodied snow, whispering vows of eternity. The door burst open without prelude, and Victor filled the threshold, his presence a sudden eclipse of the firelight. His eyes locked on the blade, darkening with a storm of emotions. Recognition, fear, an unwelcome yearning. "You should not hold that," he said, voice low and edged with gravel, stepping closer. The air between them thickened, charged with the scent of sandalwood and her own rising pulse. Ilara did not lower it. Instead, she met his gaze, the fever's haze sharpening into resolve. "Then tell me why it knows my blood. Why it feels like home in a place that should be hell." He halted, mere feet away. The distance a chasm bridged only by the blade's glow. Centuries of solitude cracked under her scrutiny, revealing the man beneath the king, the one who had chosen undeath to protect a dying world, only to watch it crumble anyway. "Because some deaths span lifetimes," he murmured, extending a hand not in command, but invitation. "And yours, Ilara Voss, may be the one that redeems us both, or dooms the realm to war." In that suspended breath, as rain whispered secrets against the glass, Ilara felt the first inexorable pull. Not toward death, but toward him, a shadow promising light amid the gathering storm of choices yet to unfold. But as his fingers neared the hilt, a distant horn wailed from the battlements, harbingers of intruders from rival clans, drawn by the blade's awakening. Victor's face hardened, the ethical king yielding to the warrior, and Ilara wondered if her touch had summoned salvation or siege. The horn's wail sliced through the chamber like a blade of its own, raw and insistent, reverberating off the stone walls until the air itself seemed to shudder. Ilara's fingers tightened around the dagger's hilt, the rubies warm now against her palm, pulsing in time with the alarm that echoed from the battlements. Outside, the rain had thickened into a relentless torrent, sheets of it battering the windows like the fists of vengeful spirits, while thunder rolled in distant growls, underscoring the intrusion. Victor's hand froze mid-reach, his obsidian eyes snapping toward the arched door, the invitation in his gesture fracturing into the taut readiness of a king long schooled in survival. The scent of ozone mingled with the room's lingering cloves, sharp and electric, as if the storm itself conspired with the shadows. "Stay here," he commanded. Voice a low command wrapped in urgency, but Ilara saw the flicker of reluctance in his gaze, the ethical thread that bound him, unwilling to leave her exposed in this moment of unraveling. He turned, cloak swirling like spilled ink, and vanished into the corridor, his footsteps fading into the castle's labyrinthine hush. Alone again, Ilara lowered the blade, its weight a sudden anchor in her trembling hands. The visions it had summoned lingered at the edges of her mind. That auburn-haired woman, her ancestor perhaps, standing defiant in a field of frost, the dagger raised not in malice, but in mercy, severing chains of undeath to free a lover from torment. Was this her legacy? The fever clawed at her ribs, a dull fire that made each breath a labored rasp, but the dagger's touch had infused her with a fragile vigor, as if it leached the illness just enough to let her think, to feel the inexorable tug towards something beyond mere endurance. She set the blade back on the pedestal, covering it hastily with the dust-veiled cloth, though the rune's glow seeped through like embers refusing extinction. Pacing the room, her bare feet sinking into the rug's frayed wool, soft as forgotten promises, Ilara's thoughts spiraled. The locket at her throat felt heavier now, the thorny rose etched upon it a mirror to the dagger's peril. Beauty laced with pain, a bloom that drew blood to sustain its eternal vigil. Her mother's words resurfaced, fragmented from delirium. The marked blood calls the night. Child, it binds, but it also breaks. Abandoned by the village that had branded her cursed, Elara had always rationalized her isolation as fate's cruel jest, a healer who could not heal herself. Yet here, in Dravenholm's opulent decay, isolation twisted into intimacy, Victor's presence a shadow that both chilled and warmed, resisted yet inevitable. She desired escape, yes, but not the hollow's mud. Something deeper, a redemption she could scarcely name. A crash from the hall jolted her, shouts in a guttural tongue, the clash of steel on stone. The intruders, rival vampires from the eastern clans no doubt, scenting the blades awakening like wolves to fresh kill. Victor had spoken of wars encroaching, political machinations where alliances frayed into betrayal, human armies allying with rogue immortals to topple ancient thrones. Elara pressed against the door, ear to the wood, the grain rough under her cheek. Footsteps thundered past, mingled with the low snarls of Victor's guards, half-turned thralls, their loyalty forged in blood oaths. She should hide, cower in the bed's crimson folds, but defiance burned brighter than fear. Slipping the dagger into the folds of her dress, its hilt cold against her thigh, she cracked the door open, peering into the torchlit corridor where shadows danced like specters in frenzy. The great hall below was a maelstrom of chaos, visible through the spiraling staircase. Candelabros overturned, their flames guttering on the marble like dying stars, wax pooling in crimson rivulets that mimicked blood. Victor stood at the center, a vortex of controlled fury, his sword, a slender relic of silvered steel, flashing in arcs that severed limbs from 3 assailants. Their faces were twisted masks, eyes feral with the hunger of outcasts, cloaks tattered from border skirmishes. One lunged, fangs bared, but Victor sidestepped with immortal grace, his blade piercing the attacker's throat in a spray of dark ichor that sizzled on the stone. The air reeked of copper and singed flesh, the storm's roar amplifying the wet thuds of bodies falling. Yet even in battle, his movements held an ethic's restraint, no needless cruelty, only the precision of one who had seen too many dawns stained with regret. Elara descended a step, then another, drawn by the pull of the blade in her grasp, its runes humming faintly against her skin. A stray vampire broke from the fray, scaling the stairs with unnatural speed, his eyes locking on her like a predator scenting prey. "The Queen's blood," he hissed, voice rasping like wind through crypts, lunging with claws extended. Time fractured. Elara's fever surged, blurring the world. But the dagger leaped to her hand as if willed. She thrust instinctively, the blade sinking into his chest with a resistance like piercing velvet over iron. He crumpled, dissolving into ash that whispered to the floor, the runes flaring triumphantly. Her arm trembled, not from exertion, but revelation. The weapon obeyed her, an extension of will, tasting her blood's command. Victor whirled at the sound, his gaze finding hers across the hall's carnage. The remaining intruders faltered, sensing the shift, and fled into the night, their howls swallowed by the gale. He sheathed his sword, striding toward the stairs, blood, none his own, splattering his cloak like accusatory stars. Up close, his face was a map of shadowed emotions, relief etched in the softening of his jaw, guilt in the way his eyes avoided the ash at her feet, and something deeper, a yearning that mirrored her own turmoil. "You wielded it," he said, voice hushed amid the settling echoes, reaching the landing. His hand brushed her arm, cool through the wool, sending a shiver that had little to do with cold. The touch lingered, resisted by the rational voice in her mind. He is death incarnate, a king of shadows, yet inevitable, pulling her toward the light he hid beneath eternity's veil. "I had no choice," Elara replied, sheathing the dagger, her voice steady despite the fever's whisper. But as his fingers traced the welts on her wrist, gentle as a vow, she felt the curse and redemption entwine, love as a blade's edge, sharp with possibility. The castle groaned under the storm's assault, but within, a fragile peace bloomed, fraught with dilemmas. Whispers from the surviving guards spoke of the blade's light drawing more eyes. Traitors within the court, perhaps, scheming to claim it for their own ascension. Victor pulled her closer, his breath a cool caress against her temple. Then we face them together. But know this, Ilara, every immortal was once someone who chose not to die. What will you choose? As dawn's first pallor crept through the cracks, staining the horizon with reluctant gold, a messenger arrived, sealed missive from the village elders, demanding her return as failed tribute or war upon the hollow. The choice loomed, a ritual of loyalty torn between worlds, leaving Ilara's heart suspended in silent agony. And now, I invite you to leave a trace of your presence in the comments. Tell us where in the world you're watching from, and the exact hour you hear this story. We wish to know how far these immortal confessions travel, and at what moments of the night they find you. The missive lay unfurled on the scarred oak table in Victor's private study, its parchment edges curling like dying leaves in the hearth's dying glow. The ink, still faintly damp from the writer's haste, bled accusations across the page. The tribute has failed to appease. Return her by midday, or the hollow's blades will rise against your shadowed throne, the old packs shatter under false offerings. Ilara's fingers traced the words. The wax seal, a crude imprint of the village elder's ring, cracking under her nail like brittle bone. The room smelled of aged leather and smoldering oak, the fire's crackle a counterpoint to the storm's fading rumble outside, where dawn's reluctant light seeped through arrow-slit windows, gilding the dust motes in hues of tarnished gold. She stood apart from Victor, who leaned against the mantel, his silhouette etched sharp against the flames, the bloodstains on his cloak now dark crusts like forgotten sins. The night's battle lingered in the air between them, the acrid tang of ash from the vanquished vampire, the metallic echo of steel that still hummed in her veins from wielding the dagger. Tucked now in a velvet sheath at her belt, hidden beneath the folds of a borrowed gown of deep crimson silk that whispered against her skin like a lover's regret, the blade felt alive, its runes dormant but watchful, sinking with the fever's ebb and flow in her blood. The garment fit her poorly, too long and opulent for her frame, but its weight grounded her, a texture of velvet soft as shadowed promises against the raw welts on her wrists. Victor's eyes, those obsidian depths, fixed on the letter with a stillness that belied the storm within. Centuries of ruling had taught him the fragility of pacts, human villages bartering daughters for peace, only to turn when fear fermented into rebellion. He had forged this realm from the ruins of wars both mortal and immortal, his ethical code a bulwark against the chaos. No conquest without consent, no eternity imposed. Yet guilt coiled tighter now, a serpent in his chest, for accepting Ilara's tribute had been necessity, not desire. Her blood called to him not as sustenance, but as a mirror to his own buried humanity, the wife he had lost to plague, her refusal of undeath echoing in his solitary nights. He desired her story, her fire, but love? That was a curse he had rationalized away, deeming it a weakness that invited betrayal. Still, inevitable as the tide, it pulled, her presence thawing the frost of his isolation. "You cannot send me back," Ilara said, her voice a thread of resolve woven through the fever's rasp, breaking the silence like a pebble in still water. She met his gaze, emerald eyes shadowed by exhaustion, but unyielding. Abandoned by Eldridge Hollow, branded cursed for her marked blood, she had endured the plague's slow erosion, healing others while her body betrayed her. Disiludida, yes, in the villager's hypocrisy, but not broken beyond defiance. The locket at her throat, its thorny rose warm from her skin, pressed like a reminder, her mother's vanishing into this very castle, a tribute who had perhaps touched the blade before her, binding fates across generations. They cast me out as sacrifice, and now demand me as failure? It's a trap, meant to ignite war. Victor's jaw tightened. The faint scar along it catching the firelight, a relic from a siege where he had chosen mercy over massacre, only to lose allies to treachery. He stepped closer, the scent of sandalwood and faint iron wafting from him, mingling with the study's musty tomes that lined the walls, volumes of ancient lore on blood rites and forgotten queens. "The elders play a dangerous game," he murmured, his voice low, resonant as distant thunder rolling through valley mists. "Rival clans whisper to them, promising weapons from human forges if they unsettle my court. The blade's awakening has spread like fog through the peaks. They sense a shift, a queen rising." His gloved hand hovered near hers on the table, not touching, but close enough that the air between crackled with unspoken tension. He resisted the pull, rationalizing it as duty, protect the realm, shield her from the shadows that hungered for power. Yet her nearness stirred memories of Isolde, auburn-haired and fierce, who had wielded love as both redemption and ruin. Ilara's breath caught, the fever spiking like a thorn's prick, sending heat blooming across her chest. She clutched the locket, the metal biting into her palm, drawing a bead of blood that welled slow and crimson. The dagger at her belt hummed faintly in response, as if tasting the drop through the sheath, its power coiling through her like vines seeking light. Visions flickered again, her ancestor in snow-swept ruins, the blade raised not in war but ritual, severing a vampire's curse to grant merciful death or binding souls in eternal vow. Death hovered here, invisible specter in the room's chill drafts, whispering of choices, return to the hollow's mud and murmurs, a healer's end in isolation, or embrace this gothic intimacy where love promised transformation amid the court's brewing storms. "I am no queen," she whispered, stepping back, the silk gown pooling at her feet like spilled wine. But the words rang hollow. The blade's weight affirmed otherwise, its texture emotional as much as physical. Cold steel warmed by her touch, promising sovereignty laced with sorrow. Victor followed, his presence a gravitational force, ethical restraint warring with the solitude that had marked him for centuries. "You were sold as tribute," he said softly, "but fate has other designs. The dagger chooses its wielder, and it has tasted your blood. To return now would doom you and invite the wars I have long forestalled." The door creaked open then, admitting a gaunt advisor, his face pallid as moonlight on marble, eyes darting to the missive. "My lord, the court's nobles gather in the undercroft. They demand audience. Rumors of the blade's light have stirred unrest. Some whisper of betrayal within our ranks." Eyes turned to the east. Victor's expression hardened, the king emerging from the man, but his gaze lingered on Ilara, a silent plea woven through the command. "Prepare her chambers. No one enters without my word." As the advisor bowed and retreated, the fire popped, sending sparks dancing like fleeting hopes. Ilara turned to the window, the dawn's gold now staining the glass in fractured patterns, illuminating the valley below, where mists clung to the pines like veils of forgotten grief. The hollow's lights flickered distant, a lure of false safety. Victor's hand finally brushed hers, cool leather against her fevered skin, the touch electric, resisted yet yielding to inevitability. "Stay," he urged, voice intimate as a confession in the confessional gloom. "Let me show you the light in these shadows, not as tribute, but as equal." Her heart thudded, a mortal rhythm against his silence, love's curse blooming like the locket's rose, redemption in his eyes, but damnation in the wars it might unleash. Yet as she nodded, a shadow detached from the corridor beyond, a figure cloaked in black velvet, eyes gleaming with treacherous intent, slipping a poisoned vial into the advisor's pocket as he passed. The court's betrayal uncoiled, unseen, and Ilara's choice teetered on the blade's edge, her blood the key to a ritual that could crown or consume them both, leaving the air thick with the scent of impending fracture. The shadow in the corridor lingered like a stain on the soul, its cloaked form melting into the gloom as the advisor's footsteps echoed away, oblivious to the vial's deadly gleam now tucked against his ribs. Ilara felt it before she saw it, a prickle along her spine, sharper than the fever's grip, as if the castle itself exhaled a warning through its stone veins. The dawn light clawed higher through the arrow-slit windows, fracturing into golden shards that danced across the study's oak panels, illuminating motes of dust like fleeting memories suspended in amber. The air thickened with the scent of smoldering oak and something acrid, metallic, like the prelude to blood spilled in secret. Victor's hand withdrew from hers, the leather glove's cool imprint fading on her skin, leaving a warmth that bloomed unbidden in her chest. He turned toward the door, senses honed by centuries of intrigue sharpening into predatory focus. But Ilara's voice halted him, raw and threaded with the night's exhaustion. Wait. That shadow, it moved with purpose, not a guard. Her emerald eyes, shadowed by the illness that coiled like smoke in her lungs, fixed on the threshold where the betrayal had slithered unseen. The locket at her throat pressed against her pulse, its thorny rose etching a faint ache, a tactile reminder of legacies woven in pain and promise. She had nodded to his plea to stay, yielding to the inevitable pull between them, a love rationalized as alliance, resisted as folly, yet blooming inexorably like mist rising from the valley below. But now, doubt fractured that fragile bloom, the dagger at her belt humming faintly, its runes stirring as if scenting the poison's approach. He paused, his raven hair catching the light in silken waves, the faint scar on his jaw a silver thread of old wounds. Guilt etched deeper lines around his obsidian eyes, the weight of a king who had chosen eternity to safeguard a crumbling world, only to watch it erode through treachery. The court festers, he admitted, voice a low timbre that resonated like wind through crypts, intimate in its confession. Nobles who envy my solitude, who plot with human warlords to shatter the pacts. The blade's light has awakened ambitions long dormant. He stepped closer, the scent of sandalwood enveloping her, undercut by the faint iron of battle's residue on his cloak. His presence was a gravitational anchor, ethical restraint, warring with the solitude that had defined him since Isolde's death, her refusal of undeath a scar that mirrored his own buried desires. He longed not to claim her blood, but to share the burden of immortality, to find redemption in her mortal fire. Yet he rationalized the yearning as duty, protect the realm, or lose it to the wars encroaching from shadowed borders. Ilara's fingers brushed the dagger's hilt through the crimson silk, the velvet soft as a whispered vow against her thigh, its weight a sensory tether grounding her fevered haze. The illness surged then, a wave of heat that blurred the room's edges, making the fire's embers pulse like distant heartbeats. She leaned against the table, the parchment missive crinkling under her palm, its demands a cruel echo of her abandonment. The village that had sold her as tribute, now weaponizing her failure to ignite conflict. Disiluded by their hypocrisy, broken by the plague's slow theft of her strength, she had always clung to an ethic of endurance, heal the fractures, even as your own widened. But here, in Dravenholm's Gothic embrace, endurance twisted into transformation, Victor's gaze promising light amid the despair. Death lingered in the drafts, invisible as the traitor in the hall, whispering of choices. Return to the hollow's isolation, a healer's quiet end, or embrace this shadowed intimacy where love could redeem or curse. A gasp from the corridor shattered the moment, the advisor stumbling back into view, clutching his side where the vial's contents seeped through his tunic, dark and viscous, staining the stone like spilled night, his face contorted. Pallid skin, graying as the poison, crafted from rare nightshade and vampire ichor, ravaged his half-turned veins. "My lord," Betrayal, the Eastern envoy. He collapsed to his knees, eyes bulging with the agony of a soul torn between worlds, his breath rattling like leaves in a gale. Victor was at his side in an instant, gloved hands steadying him, but the advisor's gaze locked on Alara. Pleading. The blade. It calls the queen's right, but they seek to twist it. War from within. Alara's heart thudded, a mortal cadence against the castle's hush, as she knelt beside them, the silk gown pooling like blood around her knees. The fever receded fractionally under the dagger's subtle thrum, granting clarity sharp as moonlight on frost. She drew the blade, its rubies igniting in the dawn's glow, runes flaring with an otherworldly light that bathed the advisor's face in crimson hues. Visions cascaded, her ancestor in ritual circle, the dagger not slaying but binding, a choice of rebirth where blood mingled to forge alliance against encroaching armies. What right? She demanded, voice steady despite the turmoil. Her free hand pressing the locket's thorn into her palm, drawing fresh blood that dripped onto the stone. Warm, textured, a beat of life amid the chill. Victor met her eyes, his expression a storm of shadowed emotions. Guilt for the court's fractures he could not mend alone, yearning for the partnership fate dangled. The queen's ritual, he murmured, supporting the advisor as convulsions racked him. A binding of blood and will where the consort wields the blade to affirm sovereignty. It repels invaders, seals loyalties, but demands consent, true choice. Without it, the realm fractures. The advisor wheezed, fingers clawing at Alara's gown. The traitor, Lord Thorn, he poisons the well, seeks your blood for his ascension. His eyes glazed, body slumping into stillness, the poison claiming him in a final shudder that echoed the thunder's retreat. Horror coiled in Alara's gut, the texture of loss bitter as ash on her tongue, but revelation burned brighter. The ritual was her crossroads, love's redemption laced with eternity's curse. Victor rose, pulling her with him, his touch lingering on her arm, cool, reassuring, inevitable. Thorn has schemed for decades, allying with the Hollow's elders for this fracture. The missive was his lure. Rain-scented wind gusted through the open door, carrying the distant clamor of gathering nobles from the undercroft, their murmurs rising like a tide of suspicion. Alara sheathed the dagger, its glow dimming but persistent, sinking with her pulse. She resisted the rational fear. He is immortal, a bridge to undeath's abyss. Yet yielded to the pull, stepping into his space, the air between them charged with sandalwood and fevered heat. "Then I choose the right," she whispered, voice intimate as a vow in the confessional gloom. "Not for throne, but for the light you hide. Bind us, Victor, before betrayal consumes all." His obsidian eyes softened, centuries of solitude cracking under her resolve. But as he nodded, a horn blared from the battlements. Not intruders from without, but Thorn's forces rising from within, the undercroft erupting in clash of steel and snarls. The ritual teetered, Alara's blood the key, but the traitor's shadow loomed larger, forcing a choice between love's fragile bloom and the war it might ignite, her heart suspended in the dawn's unforgiving light. The horn's blare fractured the dawn like shattered crystal, its brazen cry reverberating through the castle's veins, summoning the clash from the undercroft into a symphony of snarls and steel. Alara's hand tightened on Victor's arm, the leather of his glove yielding under her fevered grip, a texture both anchor and abyss as the study's door splintered inward under the force of Thorn's vanguard. 3 vampires, their eyes feral slits of amber hunger, cloaks ragged from the night's hidden machinations. The air thickened with the metallic tang of drawn blades and the acrid bite of nightshade residue from the advisor's corpse, sprawled limp on the threshold like a discarded omen. Dawn's light clawed through the windows, gilding their fangs in reluctant gold, but shadows clung to them still, extensions of the traitor's ambition. Victor moved like liquid night, shoving Ilara behind the table with a gentleness that belied the warrior's surge, his sword whispering free from its scabbard in a silver arc. "The ritual. Now," he growled, voice a low thunder amid the chaos, eyes locking on hers with an intensity that stripped away centuries of restraint. Guilt warred in his obsidian gaze, the ethical king who had sworn against imposing eternity now teetering on the edge of necessity. For her blood alone could seal the rite, binding their fates against the fracture Thorn sought to unleash. He desired her not as conquest, but as the light piercing his solitude, the mortal fire that echoed Isolde's, resisted as folly yet inevitable as the blood moon's pull. "Consent, Ilara, say it, or we fall to their war." She nodded, heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, the fever coiling like thorns in her chest. But the dagger at her belt thrummed alive, its runes igniting through the velvet sheath like embers stirred by wind. The locket's rose pressed into her skin, drawing a fresh bead of blood that welled warm and viscous, trickling down her collarbone to stain the crimson silk, a symbolic offering textured with the salt of sweat and the iron promise of choice. Abandoned by the hollow's mud and murmurs, disiludida by a world that branded her cursed, Ilara had endured as healer, mending fractures while her own widened. Now transformation beckoned, not death's quiet veil, but rebirth's sharp bloom, love's redemption laced with eternity's curse. "I choose you," she whispered, voice intimate as a breath in confessional gloom, rationalizing the leap as survival, even as it bloomed inexorable in her soul. The first assailant lunged, claws raking the air where Victor's throat had been a heartbeat prior, but he countered with lethal precision, blade slicing through tendon and bone in a spray of dark ichor that sizzled on the oak floor. The scent of singed flesh mingled with the study's leather-bound tomes, their pages rustling like whispers of ancient betrayals. Ilara drew the dagger, its hilt fitting her palm as if forged for it, rubies pulsing hot against her skin, sinking with her pulse until the fever's haze sharpened into clarity. She thrust at the second vampire, the blade piercing his shoulder with a resistance like velvet over iron, runes flaring crimson as he howled, dissolving into ash that whispered to the stone. Her blood's command, inherited from ancestors who had wielded it not in malice, but mercy. Thorn himself emerged then from the corridor's maw, a silhouette of velvet and venom, his face a mask of aristocratic disdain, eyes gleaming with the greed of one who had schemed through shadowed courts and human alliances. Born in the 16th century amid plague-ravaged Vienna, turned by a rival lord whose betrayal had scarred him with ambition, Thorn had clawed his way to Victor's counsel, nursing grudges like open wounds. Solitary in his treachery, he rationalized power as redemption, guilt twisted into justification for the wars he ignited. "The Queen's blood is mine," he snarled, voice silken poison, flinging a vial of alchemical fire that shattered against the mantle, flames erupting in a roar that devoured the hearth's remnants, heat blooming fierce and acrid across Ilara's face. Victor parried Thorn's strike, swords clashing in sparks that danced like fleeting stars, the force reverberating through the room like thunder's echo. "She chooses freely," he retorted, breath steady despite the onslaught, his movements a dance of ethical fury. No excess, only the precision born of centuries guarding fragile peace. But Thorn pressed, whispering barbs of doubt, "Your solitude weakens us, brother. She is tribute, not consort. Her fevered blood will taint the rite, doom us to human blades at our gates." The words clawed at Victor, stirring the ghost of his wife's refusal, the guilt of lives outlived, but Ilara's presence steadied him, her dagger's glow a beacon amid the fray. She circled, the silk gown tearing at the hem with each step, its fibers whispering against her legs like regrets shed. The third assailant lunged at her, but she spun, blade meeting his in a clash that jarred her bones, the runes surging power through her veins, leeching the fever's grip, infusing vigor that tasted of wild pine and starlit resolve. Death hovered in the smoke, invisible specter amid the chaos, its chill breath on her neck as Thorn broke through Victor's guard, sword grazing the king's shoulder in a shallow cut that wept black ichor. Victor staggered, but Alara was there, dagger plunging into Thorn's side, not to kill, but to bind, the runes flaring as her bloodied locket pressed to the wound, invoking the ritual's core, a choice of mercy over massacre. Thorn recoiled, the blade's magic unraveling his venomous hold, his form convulsing as visions assailed him, echoes of his turning's betrayal, the wars he had sown crumbling under the weight of forgotten humanity. He fled into the shadows, snarling oaths of return, his forces scattering like mist before dawn's advance. The Undercroft's clamor faded to echoes, the castle groaning in exhausted relief, rain-scented wind gusting through shattered panes to cleanse the air of ash and ambition. Victor turned to Alara, sheathing his sword with trembling hands, the cut on his shoulder already knitting under immortal grace. He drew her close, forehead resting against hers, cool skin to fevered warmth, the scent of sandalwood enveloping her like a vow. "The right binds us," he murmured, voice raw with shadowed compassion, fingers tracing the locket's thorn without drawing blood. "Your choice redeems what guilt has cursed, eternity not imposed but shared." Love's texture bloomed between them, soft as the silk now torn, sharp as the dagger's edge, resisted no longer, inevitable as the light-piercing Gothic veils. Yet, as dawn crested fully, staining the valley in gold and revealing the hollow's distant fires, rebels rallied by Thorn's whispers, the missive's trap sprung. Alara felt the ritual's weight settle, a transformation incomplete. Her fever lingered, a reminder of mortality's fragile bloom, the choice between life and undeath suspended in ethical twilight. She had saved the realm, but at what cost to her soul? Victor's embrace tightened, promising light in the shadows, but the wars loomed, betrayal's shadow eternal, leaving her heart echoing with the quiet agony of redemption's price. If this story has already captured you, leave a like. It helps the voices of those who chose eternity reach more hearts. Subscribe if you believe mercy can resurrect even the damned.